The stars above were quiet, but inside the meeting hall the air was full of fire and fear. The two alien empires, the Varnak and the Titrine, had met face to face after many years of Cold War. Both sides had come to talk about peace, but no one truly believed it would happen. The Varnak were proud and strong with tall bodies made of red stone and fire inside them. The Titrine were cold and sharp like steel, and when they moved fast and talked even faster, but their words cut like blades. The room was large and round, built on a neutral moon. Far from both homeworlds, tall windows showed the stars and the waiting ships of each empire, dark shapes hiding behind the light. The table was metal and long, shaped like a blade, and every chair was taken by someone important, leaders, guard, advisors, and all of them watched each other with eyes full of hate. Words were spoken, but no one listened. Threats were made, but no one flinched. The talks were falling apart minute by minute. The Varnak leader shouted about betrayal. The Titrine queen raised her voice and called it a lie. Everyone was ready for war. Everyone was tired of talking. Then the doors opened slow and smooth, and in walked two Terrans. One was the diplomat, a short man with white hair and a calm voice. He wore no armor and carried no weapon. His face was like stone, and his eyes looked at no one. But the table behind him walked someone taller, someone stronger, someone who looked like he belonged on a battlefield, not in a peace meeting. The human bodyguard wore a simple black suit, but his body moved like a blade hidden under cloth. His face was quiet, no anger, no smile, no fear. His eyes scanned the room like he could see things no one else could. His skin was pale, his hair short and dark, and on his wrist was a mark no one could read, not even the Varnak scholars or Titrine mind speakers. The Varnak laughed. One guard shouted, "What is this? Did you bring a toy?" The Titrine queen smirked and said, "The human sent a babysitter." The room echoed with cruel laughter, but the bodyguard said nothing. He stood behind the diplomat like a wall made of silence. The Terran diplomat raised one hand, and the room grew. Still, he said, "We are here to stop blood, not spill more. We asked for one last try." But the leaders shook their heads. The Varnak leader roared, "No more lies. We end this today." And the Titrine queen hissed, "Yes, we are done with games." Outside in space, the fleets moved into position. Warships locked targets, shields hummed, weapons waited for the signal. The stars still looked quiet, but death was close, very close. Inside the hall, the human bodyguard took one step forward, just one step. The floor did not shake, the lights did not flicker, but the air changed. Every being in the room felt it, a weight of pressure like gravity had grown stronger. Some guards reached for their weapons, but the human only lifted one hand. He said one word, his voice soft but clear. He said, "Do not," and no one moved, not even the boldest soldier. The Varnak leader narrowed his eyes. "Who are you to command us?" he said. The Titrine queen asked, "What power hides in your skin?" The human did not answer. He looked at them both, and then at the table, and then at the stars beyond the window, and he waited silent and still like a storm that had not yet come. A signal flashed in the diplomat's hand, a message from the stars, a code. Only Terrans could read. His eyes widened, but he nodded once. He turned to the alien leaders and said, "If war begins, only one side will survive, and it will not be yours." The aliens laughed again, but it was nervous laughter this time. They looked at the human again, and something inside them whispered, "This is no ordinary man. This is no tool, no servant, no simple bodyguard." In one corner, a young Titrine scout whispered a name, an old name, a myth. She said it in her own tongue, and her voice shook. The Varnak warrior beside her heard the name, and his stone eyes went wide with fear. He had heard it too during the last great battle on the edge of space, when a single Terran soldier had made a fleet vanish without leaving a trace. They called him the Peacebringer, not because he spoke, but because after he left there was no one left to fight. Now he was here in this room, watching, waiting, and the countdown to war had already begun. The silence in the chamber stretched long and heavy, and no one dared to break it. The Titrine queen looked at her generals, and then at the human bodyguard, but his eyes showed nothing. His breathing was quiet, and his hands rested at his sides like a statue made from calm shadows. The Varnak leader clenched his fists, and the fire in his skin flickered hotter. But he too said nothing. For the first time in many cycles, he felt something cold, not fear, not doubt, but something older, something he could not name. Outside the moon, the war fleets turned in space, giant shapes drifting like sleeping beasts, but inside every ship, alarms waited, fingers hovered over triggers, commands stood ready in mouths, only waiting for the word. Yet the word did not come, not yet. The Terran diplomat sat slowly at the table, his hands open, his voice soft but strong. He spoke of loss, he spoke of stars burning for no reason, of worlds shattered, over pride of children born into silence, an air that no longer moved. He did not speak long, and he did not beg, but the images stayed in every mind, and still the human behind him did not blink. One Teatrine tactician could not take it anymore. He stepped forward and shouted, "What is this? Are we to be lectured by a race barely old enough to leave its planet? You are children playing at peace. You know nothing of war, nothing of pain." The human looked at him, then really looked, and the tactician froze, because in those eyes there was something more than age, more than power, more than history. There was memory, deep, endless memory of things no mind should hold, of planets falling without sound, of screams that could never fade. He tried to speak again, but his voice failed, and he stepped back, shaking, though he did not know why. The Varnak leader rose tall and proud, and said, "If you came to scare us with myths, you will fail. We are not afraid of your kind. We faced the devourers alone, while you hid behind shields and science. We bled while you built your cities of glass. We do not bow to ghosts." The human took one step forward again. No weapons, no threats, just a step, and the floor beneath him held like stone, though the walls seemed to lean ever so slightly, as if drawn toward him, as if gravity itself shifted in his wake. He reached into his jacket, and for a moment every guard raised their weapons, but he only pulled out a small object, no bigger than a finger, a silver cube with glowing edges pulsing with soft blue light. He placed it on the table and stepped back without a word. The cube clicked and hummed and rose into the air, spinning slowly. It projected images into the space above the table, images from another time not too far ago, but far enough that most had already forgotten or chosen to forget. A battlefield in the dark between star-shattered ships and drifting bodies of Varnak cruisers, split in two, fire blooming from its heart. Trine, carrier torn by light, that danced like shadows wrapped in flame, and in the middle of it all one ship moving silent. And alone, a Terran vessel smaller than the rest, faster than thought, and deadly like a storm made of knives. The cube played voices too, not for now, but from the past recordings of Varnak captains crying for help, of Teatrine pilots whispering prayers of silence after silence after silence. And then one voice, loud, clear, human. "Target neutralized, moving to next zone." That was all it said, but it chilled the room deeper than any weapon could, and the cube went dark, falling quiet again, resting on the table like a whisper that had already been heard. The Teatrine queen stared at the cube, then at the human, her words slow and careful. "Why bring this? What do you wish to show us with pain and ruin?" The Terran diplomat answered, not to threaten, not to gloat, but to remind. He said, "Peace does not come when power is equal. It comes when power no longer matters." The Varnak leader snorted, but softer than before, his fire dimmer than when he entered the room. His generals looked unsure now, their hands no longer on their blades, their eyes on the human, as if trying to understand a puzzle that refused to solve. Then the human spoke for the second time, his voice not loud, but heavy, like it carried more than just sound. He said, "War ends when you choose it, or when you no longer can." One Teatrine youngling leaned forward and whispered, "Is he the one from the old battle, the one who walked through fire and never looked back, the one who touched the mind of the devourer and made it turn away?" Another Varnak soldier nodded slowly, though his face showed doubt. His voice trembled when he said, "They called him the Whisperer of Silence, because wherever he walked, no one spoke again." The room held its breath again, though none had chosen to. The human stood still again, his job not done, his presence still heavy, his name still unknown. The Terran diplomat took a long breath, then placed his hand on the table, this time not with threat, but with hope. He said, "We do not seek to command, only to remind what happens when we forget that life is more than pride, that stars are not ours to waste, that war writes no victory, only pages soaked in blood." One Teatrine elder said, "Perhaps the humans know more than we thought. Perhaps wisdom does not wear age, but pain and memory." A Varnak warrior whispered, "Perhaps we're not the strongest, perhaps we never were." Outside, the stars still burned and the ships still waited, but their weapons no longer hummed with the same hunger, their crews no longer watched with the same hate. Something had shifted, something had cracked in the wall of certainty they had all built for so long. Inside the room, the human turned slowly and stepped back behind the diplomat once more. Not a word, not a glance, just silence, like peace wrapped in flesh. And for the first time in many years, both Varnak and Reen sat down at the same table without fire in their hands or death in their hearts. The chamber felt different now, not colder, not warmer, just different, as if something invisible had shifted like old chains, slipping from forgotten wrists like the air, had remembered how to breathe again. The Reen Queen looked at her council, their sharp eyes, scanning the silence not with fear, but with thought, while the Varnak leader sat still like a stone carved from stars, not speaking, not blinking, as though deep inside him something was trying to understand something that had no words. The human still stood behind the Terran diplomat, quiet and unreadable, a wall, with no door night, with no moon, his eyes unmoving, but watching everything, not just the faces, but the spaces between, the hesitation, the tiny tremble in a hand, the way one Reen Noble kept touching her necklace, not out of habit, but out of memory. He saw it all and said nothing. The Terran diplomat leaned forward now with calm and care, his voice soft, as if speaking to children who had seen too much of fire and not enough of light. He said, "We are not here to claim, we are not here to take, we are only here to offer what no weapon ever gave, what no shield ever held, a future not built on fear, but on choice." The Varnak leader spoke, his voice lower than before, like a mountain cracking slowly. He asked, "Why now? Why offer peace when we have stood at the edge for so long?" The human's eyes shifted slightly, and the Terran answered, "Because standing at the edge teaches you what falling really means, because we have fallen more times than we can count, and we learn not to build wings, but to build bridges, because falling alone is pain, but falling together is how we rise." The words hung in the air, not like chains, but like seeds waiting for the right silence to take root. One Reen child spoke from the back of the room, her voice tiny and shaking, but still there. She asked, "Is he the one who ended the shadow bloom? Is he the one who walked through the dark and made it quiet?" All eyes turned to the human again, and he looked at her for the briefest second and nodded, just once, no more, no less. The Varnak leader inhaled slowly, his fire dim, but alive. He said, "They say your people do not fear death, that you send your soldiers to places even the void turns from, and they return not with stories, but with silence. What kind of species creates men like that?" The Terran diplomat smiled, not proud, not smug, just sad. He replied, "The kind that had no choice, the kind that watched too many stars go dark, the kind that learned hope only survives when someone carries it through the fire." A new cube rose from the diplomat's bag, this one dark red, with a heartbeat glow pulsing like something alive. He placed it gently on the table, and everyone leaned closer, not out of command, but out of pull. The cube opened with a sound like memory breaking, and it showed not war, not death, but moments of strange stillness. A human soldier pulling a Varnak child from rubble, carrying her across flame, a Reen medic bandaging, a human pilot despite their ancient grudge, a shared campfire in the ruins of what was once called Outpost Horizon, with laughter rising between broken helmets and cracked armor. These were not moments of victory, these were moments of choice, and the room fell quiet again, because even the oldest generals have forgotten that war is not only about killing sometimes, it is about not killing when you easily could. The human took one step forward again, and even now no one moved to stop him. Instead, they watched and waited, as if something inside them knew this moment mattered more than all the others before it. He reached toward the red cube, and it shifted again, now showing a final image, one that no one in the room expected: a gathering of Terran children in a field of blue flowers under a broken sky, rebuilding a tower once used for war, now shaped for light, a symbol not of strength, but of survival. And above the tower, the human banner waved not as a warning, but as a reminder. The Reen Queen whispered, "This is your answer, not words, not power, but memory." The Varnak leader said nothing, but his eyes stayed on the children in the projection, and his fists no longer clenched. The Terran diplomat looked at the Reen Queen and the Varnak leader and said, "The choice is always yours. War waits behind every breath, but so does peace. We have brought no army, only one soldier. We have brought no throne, only one table. Choose not for your pride, but for those not yet born." And for the first time, both leaders looked not at each other, but at the human, and for the first time, they both nodded, not in surrender, not in fear, but in respect. Outside, the stars still turned, but slower, as if the universe had leaned in to listen. Inside the chamber, the silence returned, but this time it was full, not empty, the kind of silence that follows truth, not the silence of fear, but of understanding the kind of silence that ends wars not with blasts but with breath. The human turned again, stepping back into the shadow behind the diplomat where he began, and his job for now was done. But everyone knew this was not the end, only the beginning of something new, something uncertain but possible. Because now they had seen the eyes that remembered. The chamber door opened again, but this time no alarms, no guards, no weapons, just quiet steps and softer lights, a sign that something inside the heart of this ancient station had begun to shift, as if the cold metal itself had started to warm to the idea of something new, something alive. They had agreed to speak again, not as enemies, not as conquerors, but as something not yet named: the Varnak leader, the Teatrine queen, and the Terran diplomat with the human shadow. Behind him, still silent, still watching. A new table had been formed, longer, wider, round, with no sharp corners, because sharp corners meant sharp minds, and this was not the time for cuts. The Teatrine queen placed her wings on the table, a sign of trust, a symbol of her kind's oldest code. When the wings touch the stone, peace may follow if peace is deserved. The Varnak leader came next, without his warhammer, without his iron crown, just his breath, and his voice low and strong like drums from a far mountain. He sat and said nothing for a moment, letting silence speak first. The Terran diplomat placed nothing on the table, just his hands folded, calm, steady like rivers holding back storms, and behind him the human did not blink, did not speak, only breathed like a statue carved from memory. The conversation began not with politics, but with stories, not of blood, not of glory, but of the small things, the way a soldier once gave water to a Teatrine scout, the way a Varnak engineer rebuilt a Terran drone and left it with flowers before walking away. Small things that mattered more than planets. They listened not to respond, but to understand, each story building a path not of words, but of weight, every shared tale adding another brick to the bridge they did not yet believe could hold. But the human already knew it would, because he had walked on worse bridges and never fallen. Suddenly a new voice entered the room. It came from the far wall, from a screen long and used, dusty from years of silence, a voice mechanical, yet smooth. It was the central system of the Galactic Archive requesting permission to join. They allowed it not out of duty, but out of curiosity, and the screen flickered to life, showing data, not numbers, but names of the fallen from every world, every war, every loss, and then a pattern began to form. The system showed the moments before each war, each spark before the fire, and every time it came back to one thing: fear. Not hate, not greed, not power, but fear, the fear of what the other might do, the fear of being the first to bleed, the fear of what peace might cost. The Teatrine queen leaned closer, her eyes wide not with shock, but with realization, and she said, "So we fight not because we want to win, but because we fear what happens if we do not." The Varnak leader did not speak, but his jaw tightened like someone holding back a scream or a cry. And the human behind the Terran diplomat finally moved. He stepped forward, not fast, not slow, just forward, and placed something on the table. It was a stone, black and smooth, not from any known world, and when they looked into it, they saw not their reflections, but their regrets. It was a relic from a dead planet, a place where the last war had turned oceans to ash, where both sides lost so completely that even memory had no place to hide. He said nothing as they stared into it, but they felt his message clear as stars: we do not bring peace, because we are kind. We bring peace because we remember what happens when we forget. The Terran diplomat looked to the leaders and asked a question that echoed louder than any cannon: what are you willing to lose to avoid losing everything? There was no answer, only thought, and sometimes thought is louder than speech. The meeting paused for rest, but no one left the room. Instead, they sat in silence, eyes closed, minds open, letting the stories sink deeper than bone. Later, as the stars outside shifted in slow dance, the Teatrine queen spoke again. She told of her ancestor, a warrior who once chose death over mercy, and how that choice echoed through generations until now. She said, "I choose not to echo him. I choose to stop the sound." The Varnak leader opened a small container from his belt. Inside was a piece of cloth torn from the first Varnak flag, soaked in the blood of a forgotten prince. He placed it on the table and said, "Let this no longer be a symbol of war, but a reminder of why we ended." The Terran diplomat nodded, not in triumph, but in respect, and the human stepped back once more in his shadow, his part done for now. They all looked at each other, and for the first time, they did not see species or history or blood. They saw beings trying to stop a wheel that had spun too long. Outside, the chamber lights turned softer ships, power down, not for sleep, but for peace fleets sent signals not of warning, but of welcome. And deep in the heart of the ancient station, the fire beneath the armor began to cool. The stars outside the station moved slowly like old dancers who had seen too many wars and forgotten how to smile. And deep inside the diplomatic chamber, the three leaders sat still, surrounded by a silence that was no longer cold, but curious, like a child hearing music for the first time. The Teatrine Queen tilted her head slightly, her antennae twitching to a rhythm that only she could hear, as if her people's memory was singing through her bones, whispering stories too old for words and too sacred for war. The Varnak leader did not move, his massive hands resting on the table, his fingers curled around nothing, yet holding the weight of 1,000 years of conflict and pride that cracked but never bent until now, when bending seemed braver than breaking. The Terran diplomat breathed slowly, his eyes not on the others, but on the human who stood again in shadow, his presence still sharp and strange like a knife made of silence and memory. No one spoke because words were too small for what was happening and yet too heavy to carry without care, and so they let the moment stretch across the room like the horizon before a storm, neither fearful nor safe. Then the central system spoke once more, its voice gentle this time, as if trying not to wake something sleeping too deeply inside them. All it offered one final archive, a record, not of battles, not of deaths, but of survivors, the ones who lived between wars, the forgotten witnesses who planted seeds on burned soil and built homes from broken weapons. The images flickered across the screen, families of mixed-species children playing in fields grown from once toxic ground, old warriors teaching young ones how to dance instead of how to aim. The archive asked one question, not in words, but in feeling: what if this was the future you could have? The Teatrine Queen closed her eyes, her wings shivering with a kind of sorrow that was not weakness, but wisdom, the kind only queens and mothers knew when they watched their world spin too close to fire. The Varnak leader opened his fist and placed a small object on the table, a gear from a broken war machine, rusted and worn. It was his father's last command unit, a symbol of destruction, now offered as a relic of hope. The Terran diplomat leaned forward, his voice soft but clear. What if we choose this? What if we let the weapons grow old and the wounds grow quiet? What if we stop writing war into our blood? The human did not speak. He stepped to the table again, and this time he placed a single photo. It was not official, not historic, just a picture of a Terran soldier sharing food with a Varnak scout while a Teatrine medic wrapped both their wounds. The three smiling like peace was not a miracle, but a memory waiting to be remembered. Something shifted in the room, not in light or air, but in feeling, like a wall melting, like stone turning to sand. And for the first time, they all felt it, truly felt it, the absence of fear. The Teatrine Queen spoke first, and her voice cracked like old paper, but held like steel. She said, "My people were taught that only strength earns peace, but I see now peace is the true strength, and I will teach them again." The Varnak leader nodded once, slow and deep, like a mountain bowing to the wind, and said, "We have chased glory and buried our sons. I will chase no more. I will bury no more." The Terran diplomat placed his hand over the photo and looked at them both, then to the screen and then to the human, and said, "Then let us write a new archive, one that begins here, not with battle, but with choice." The central system responded with lights pulsing softly across the chamber doors, unlocking not to escape, but to welcome. The choice now belonged to all of them, and they were no longer prisoners of history. Outside the chamber, a signal was sent, not of surrender, not of demand, but of invitation, a message that echoed across the stars through satellites and silent fields, calling others to come, not to fight, not to claim, but to listen. The human turned away, then, his duty done, his shadow shrinking behind him as the chamber filled with light and promise. He had never spoken, and yet he had said more than anyone, and they all knew the war had ended not in speeches or treaties, but in the stillness of his silence. The Teatrine Queen stood and stretched her wings as if for the first time in centuries they could lift her without pain. The Varnak leader stood beside her, taller, but not heavier, and the Terran diplomat walked between them, a bridge not of stone or steel, but of belief. They left the chamber together, the photo still on the table, the gear still shining with rust, and truth, the stories still floating in the air, waiting to become stars. In the corridor, others waited, ambassadors, guard watchers from a dozen worlds. They had heard the silence, they had felt the pause, they had seen the stars move slower. The leaders nodded, and the human nodded too, and for the first time no one feared his presence. Instead, they welcomed it, for now they understood he was not a weapon, not a warning, but a witness. The station breathed a sound like wind through old trees, and the stars outside blinked as if watching and smiling. And somewhere across the galaxy, where a child once hid from the sound of war, a new sound echoed, laughter simple and soft and true. Because no one had expected the human, and yet because of him, peace had come in minutes. The news spread like a river, breaking its banks, flowing through every communication line, every hidden channel, every forgotten corner of space, where war once whispered in every breath and fear had built homes and broken hearts. Across the stars, leaders paused in their meetings, soldiers lowered their weapons, even machines hesitated in their endless calculations because something had shifted, something deep and strange and soft. The Terran Broadcast Center beamed the footage to all allied and neutral zones, showing the moment of stillness, the moment when the Tetrine Queen opened her wings in peace, the moment the Varnak leader laid down a relic of destruction, and the moment the human stood silent and still, yet louder than any war cry ever known. At first, some refused to believe it, calling it false, a trick, a weakness wrapped in diplomacy. Others waited suspicious, afraid it was bait, but the silence did not break, and no attack followed. The human did not stay for celebrations or news reports. He returned to his ship, quiet and alone, while the station around him filled with voices and laughter and relief. No one stopped him. They only watched him walk like a ghost, finally free from his haunting. The Terran diplomat wanted to thank him, to speak one more time, but the human had already gone his path, never needing applause or reward, only the space to do what he was meant to do. In the Tetrine, homeworld ceremonies began not with fireworks or chants, but with gardens where the old battlefields once lay, seeds planted in lines where bullets used to fall, and children now walking where soldiers once crawled. The queen appeared in the sacred temple, without armor, without guards, speaking to her people with bare wings and open hands. She said, "We were taught to sting first and speak last, but I was wrong. I saw a human do nothing, and everything changed." On Varnak, the change was slower but real. The great war statues were no longer polished, now left to rust naturally as a reminder of weight. The leader visited schools instead of bunkers and told stories not of heroes in war, but of survivors in peace. The archives began to shift one by one. Old files tagged as restricted were released to the public, showing truths long hidden, showing battles lost, not only in numbers, but in meaning, and above all showing the faces of those who had tried to stop the wars and failed, not because they were weak, but because they had been alone. Now, they were not alone. Now, they had the image of a human standing between enemies and changing them, without a weapon, without a speech, only a presence filled with something none could name, yet all could feel. Back on Earth, the leaders were cautious, as always, calculating benefits and risks, but even the hardest of them found themselves staring at the silent footage, replaying it in their minds, asking how one man had done what fleets and treaties could not. And while they debated and analyzed, the people celebrated, not in loud parades, but in quiet ways. Windows opened for the first time in years, flags of war replaced with painted stars, walls once marked with warnings now covered in songs written by schoolchildren. The broadcast was played again and again in refugee camps where displaced families held each other tighter, knowing perhaps now they could return home in ships that once carried them from fire. They could now ride back toward peace. The alien races began exchanging not just ambassadors, but teachers and artists and builders, sharing stories and skills, exchanging what made them different and finding what made them the same. For the first time, a joint archive was proposed, not run by one race or one council, but by many, a living memory of the galaxy, not shaped by fear, but shaped by shared breath and shared silence and shared hope. The human had no name in official records, his identity erased long ago. for reasons no one fully understood, but now he had 1,000 names in every language across the stars. Some called him the Shadow Walker, others called him the Silent Bridge, the Varnak called him the one who carried peace in his bones, and the Teatrine called him the Whisper who ended thunder. Songs were written about him, some soft like lullabies, others fierce like old hymns, and even a few that mixed both, because peace is not the absence of strength, but the balance of it. Stories spread of others like him, those who tried to do right without asking for reward, and slowly those stories grew louder as more people chose to follow that same quiet path. A generation began to rise, shaped not by victory in battle, but by the courage to speak before shooting, to listen before shouting, to stand before striking, and to wait when fear told them to run. And in the corners of the universe, where violence still echoed, the enemies of peace gathered, confused and angry, trying to understand how everything had changed without warning, without force, without demand. They watched the footage, trying to find the trick, the weapon, the hidden code, but found nothing, only a man, a shadow, a moment. And in their confusion, some began to doubt their own fire. Some began to think, if peace could come in minutes, what else had they misunderstood for centuries? In hidden places where secret wars were still planned, some missions were quietly canceled, some commanders stood down, some fleets turned away, without orders, without resistance, just a decision born from something new. Back at the diplomatic station, a monument was built not of gold or steel, but of light, a hologram of the three leaders standing side by side, and behind them a single figure, without detail, only shadow. The plaque said, "No one expected the human, but now we know we must expect peace." And somewhere deep in space, on a quiet ship with no flag and no name, the human watched the stars shift and fade like waves in the dark, and knew his part was done for now. But others would come now, others would try now, because silence had been heard, and stillness had spoken, and peace had taken root. Not in a treaty, not in a throne, but in the heart of one who never needed to speak to be heard. Years passed like drifting smoke across forgotten skies, and still the story of the human who stopped a war continued to ripple through the galaxy like a song without end, whispered from lips to ears and echoed in the hearts of those who had never known stillness until that day. Children who were born in bunkers now walked open fields where flowers had taken the place of fallen soldiers, and they did not ask about war. As their first question, they asked about the human who stood between fire and silence, who changed the galaxy, without a weapon, without a roar, without even a name. His face was never found in archives, his voice never recorded, and yet every race had drawn him in their own way, on paper, on stone, on screens, and in dreams, sometimes with armor, sometimes in robes, sometimes in shadow, but always alone and always unshaken. The peace he left behind was not perfect. It cracked sometimes in hidden corners and dark places where old anger still waited to rise, but even there his story arrived like a breeze and turned fire into ember, and ember into ash, and ash into soil. The great library orbiting the neutral star of Elkaris grew taller with every story added, and at its heart sat a single room lit by soft starlight, containing no books, no scrolls, only a single empty chair with the words "He stood," so you could sit etched in every language known to the stars. Many visitors came just to sit in that chair, some for minutes, some for days, and some never returned the same again, because silence speaks when truth sits close, and peace often begins where noise ends. Diplomats from ancient rivals now greeted each other with a pause before words, a tradition born from that moment on the station when stillness ended centuries of war, and that pause was now called the human breath, not in mockery, but in honor. Art changed across the galaxy. Sculptures no longer showed warriors with blades raised, but strangers with hands open. Paintings no longer bathed in red and black, but in soft gold and blue, and new instruments were invented to capture the quiet that had once filled that station the day the human stood. On Earth, the legacy of the Nameless One found its place in the hearts of those who had lost more than they could ever speak in words, and they built gardens where war memorials once stood, with paths that crossed but never collided, and wind chimes that whispered like a silence. Every year on the day of the stillness, known simply as First Peace, the galaxy lit no fireworks and held no feasts. Instead, they listened, they walked, they sat with others, and said nothing not out of emptiness, but out of unity, and in that silence millions felt seen. The T'Reen sent a ship of seeds to every world once touched by war, and in each box a small note written in gentle script read grow, what we could not until he stood and made us try. The Varnak, who once taught only combat, now trained emissaries in the art of presence and calm, and they renamed their military academy the House of Listening, and its highest medal was not for victory, but for restraint. Even the machine minds who once calculated survival through dominance updated their core, programming, introducing a new variable called the human effect, which measured the power of influence without input force or feedback, only presence. And while some doubted or forgot, or chose to move on, there remained those who searched still not for the man himself, but for the spark that made him do what none else could, for the root of the silence that changed stars. Some believed he had been trained in an ancient Terran monastery lost to time. Others said he had seen too much war to ever lift a hand again, and a few whispered that he was no longer human at all, but something in between, something forged in sorrow and sharpened in hope. A group of young explorers formed, calling themselves the Shadow Walkers, and they traveled to old battlefields, offering aid, sharing food, and simply standing in places where rage still lived, hoping their presence would echo his, and sometimes it did. In one forgotten asteroid station where an old feud had reignited, two factions prepared to destroy each other, but a child stepped between them holding a drawing of the silent human, and said he waited so we could stop, and somehow they did. The silent movement, as it became known, did not preach or campaign. It simply existed like a quiet wind that moved when no one watched, bringing change where noise had failed. And through it all the question remained, where was he? Where had he gone? Did he watch? Did he know? Did he care? In a distant system beyond trade routes and politics, a traveler once claimed to have met a man who never spoke, but listened to the wind in the trees of a long-dead world. And when the traveler asked who he was, the man only smiled and returned to his quiet work, rebuilding a ruined garden one stone at a time. Whether true or myth, it did not matter, because the legacy was not in the man, but in the mirror he placed before the galaxy, and in what each soul saw when they dared to look into it. The peace was not born from fear, nor sustained by threats. It was carried in the hearts of those who chose to remember him, and it grew like wildflowers through broken walls, stubborn and soft, beautiful and fierce. And so the story of the human who stood without moving, who changed everything by being everything they were not, was passed from one star to another like a torch that never burned, yet always warmed. Because in the end, the galaxy did not remember how many battles were fought or won or lost. It remembered the moment when silence was louder than war, when one stood and many listened and all chose to breathe again.